On the night of February 27, 1942, 119 men and one RAF technician dropped out of the dark over occupied France, most of them not yet fully qualified to jump. Major John Frost commanded a company that had existed for barely 2 months. Cox, the technician beside him, had exactly one job: reach a German radar dish before the Germans reached him, and take it apart with his bare hands under fire. Nobody promised any of them a ride home. This was Operation Biting, and by dawn it would either give Britain the intelligence it desperately needed, or bury 120 men on a French beach. By late 1941, Bomber Command was losing aircraft over Germany faster than anyone in London wanted to admit. The cause traced back to two paired German radar systems, Freya, which watched for approaching bombers from miles out, and Wurzburg, which then locked a night fighter directly onto the kill. Together they formed what the Germans called the Kammhuber Line, a belt of coordinated interception stretching along the coast. Britain had photographs of the dishes. What it didn't have was a single working component to actually study. The man who pushed hardest for a raid wasn't a soldier. Dr. R.V. Jones was 28 years old and MI6 chief scientific advisor, working out of a cramped office in Broadway buildings. Signals, intercepts and photographs had already told him what the Wurzburg dish probably did. What they couldn't tell him was how to jam it. Jones argued to the high command that studying diagrams would never be enough. Someone needed to physically get inside a Wurzburg set and bring pieces of it home. It was, by his own account, an unusually hard sell. Photographs and theory only went so far. Admiral Lord Mountbatten, running the newly formed Combined Operations Command, proposed something bolder: drop a raiding force directly onto the site, seize the radar by force, and pull everyone out by sea before the Germans could organize a response. A pure airborne raid risked stranding the men on the wrong side of the channel with a stolen radar and no way home. A pure naval raid risked losing surprise before anyone reached the dish at all. Combining both was the only version of the plan that gave Britain a real chance at coming home with the goods. Brigadier Gale picked C Company of the newly formed 2nd Parachute Battalion for the job, precisely because it was new. He wanted his 1st Battalion kept whole for a larger operation later, so this one drew the short straw instead. The catch: C Company had barely finished forming. Many of the men hadn't completed parachute qualification. Their own commanding officer, John Frost, had failed his first jump course in November and only scraped through a hurried second attempt in January, weeks before leading well over 100 men into occupied France. None of it would work without help on the ground. The French resistance network run by Gilbert Renault, known to the British only as Colonel Remy, had already been feeding back details of the Bruneval site for months. A Haitian-born mechanic working under the name Charlemagne and a French aviator called Paul confirmed something the planners needed badly: the beach below the radar hadn't been mined. Get the raiders down alive, and there would be an open path to the sea waiting for them. The plan split the raiding force into 3 jobs, none of them optional. One party would drop closest to the villa and radar itself, storm the position, and hold it just long enough for the job to get done. A second, larger party would form a defensive ring further out, blocking any German reinforcement from reaching the site in time. A third would fight down to the beach early and secure the evacuation point before anyone else even arrived there. Every part depended on the others landing on time and in the right place, in the dark, over unfamiliar ground. That was never a guarantee. Just after midnight on the 28th, the drop began, and it went wrong almost immediately. Whitley bombers scattered the sticks of paratroopers wider across the snow-covered fields than the plan called for, some men landing well off their intended positions in the dark and cold. There was no time to fix it. Every group that hit the ground had the same order: find your objective, now, regardless of who else has arrived yet. Frost's assault group reached the villa first and hit it hard and fast. The garrison, thinned out for the night and caught completely off guard, put up only a brief fight before it collapsed. 5 German defenders killed, 2 wounded, 2 more taken alive as the position fell. One of the 2 prisoners turned out to be exactly what Jones had hoped for without daring to ask. The Wurzburg set's own trained operator, marched off at gunpoint along with the radar he'd spent months running. While the perimeter held, Flight Sergeant Charles Cox went to work on the radar itself, and he was working against a clock nobody could see. He had never actually operated a Wurzburg set before, only trained enough to know which components mattered. Wrenches and bolt cutters in the freezing dark, gunfire still audible somewhere close by. Cox tore the receiver, the transmitter head, and key electronic components loose from a machine most of his own commanders had never touched either. With the components free and the German operator in hand, Frost's group had what they came for, and now the hardest part began. Every piece of captured radar gear and every prisoner had to move under guard, on foot, across open ground still crawling with alerted German troops, toward a beach that hadn't been secured yet either. Combined Operations had planned the outbound half of this raid in careful detail. Getting home was always going to be the part nobody could fully rehearse. Not every part of the plan matched the map. Some of the covering paratroopers had landed off target and had to fight their way toward the beach through terrain nobody had scouted for them. German reinforcements, alerted by the assault on the villa, were already moving to respond. Every extra minute spent finding the right path was a minute the whole raiding party spent exposed on open, unfamiliar ground, a long way from anywhere they could call safe. Offshore, the raid nearly ended before the men even reached the water. The transport ship Prinz Albert, waiting to receive them, had to dodge a German naval patrol, a destroyer with 2 E-boats, passing close enough in the dark that a single sighting would have ended everything. Had that patrol turned its lights the wrong way, the ship carrying the raiders' only way home would likely have been sunk on the spot, stranding the entire party on occupied French soil with no rescue coming. On the beach, the plan finally came apart completely. Frost's radio couldn't raise the Prinz Albert. There were no landing craft in sight, German troops were closing in along the cliff edge above, and for a stretch of minutes Frost genuinely prepared his men to dig in on the sand and fight to the last rather than be taken. The boats appeared only in the final minutes before that would have become necessary, and even then, 6 of them arrived on the beach at once instead of the planned 2 at a time, turning the loading itself into a scramble. The last boats pushed off the beach with covering fire still cracking behind them, and the flotilla turned for open water and England. It had taken less than 3 hours from the first parachute opening to the last man off the sand. The raiding party brought back the radar's core components, 2 German prisoners including the Wurzburg operator himself, and remarkably few casualties of their own for a raid that had come apart at almost every step along the way and still somehow held together. By morning, the flotilla was back in Portsmouth Harbor, and Jones finally had what he'd spent months arguing Britain needed, real Wurzburg hardware in British hands. Analysis of the captured receiver and the operator's own knowledge let British scientists work out the set's actual operating parameters within weeks, the exact kind of detail no aerial photograph or intercepted signal could ever have supplied on its own. The intelligence from Bruneval fed directly into 2 real countermeasures, window, an early form of chaff that could blind German radar screens with clouds of false returns, and carpet, a jammer built specifically to broadcast noise on the exact frequencies Wurzburg used. Both would go on to save RAF bomber crews for years afterward. The raid's success cut both ways. 2 German high command was furious enough about small, precise raids like this one that Hitler personally issued the infamous commando order later that year, stripping captured commandos of prisoner of war protection entirely. Bruneval became the Parachute Regiment's first battle honor, and John Frost, the officer who'd barely scraped through his own jump course 2 months earlier, would go on to lead the whole battalion at Arnhem and become one of the most famous names in British airborne history. For Churchill, the raid was proof his controversial investment in airborne forces actually worked, at a moment in the war when good news of any kind was in desperately short supply. Cox and every man who jumped that night made it home. Not every raid this war would end that way, but this one, against long odds, did.